Hello, I'm John David Ebert, and welcome to the first class of the third week in our course, our lecture course on understanding contemporary art. And what I want to do for the next 2 weeks is to discuss post-World War II German contemporary art. So I want to look at German art. So hitherto, we have only looked at the New York art scene, first with abstract expressionism, and then after that we moved on to pop art. But now, as it turns out, we will see that in Germany, at about exactly the same time, through the 1960s and 70s, the German world becomes the rival to the New York art world and matches it step by step, and in some ways I think possibly even surpasses it. Now, the thing about German art, and what I'd like to talk about in this video, is sort of a brief history of German art, because there are some peculiar characteristics about German art that make it very different from the rest of European art. One of which is that when you're reading a history book, one of the art history books, like say Gombrich's The Story of Art, let's say, you always find that the developments in German art are characterized as being peripheral to developments that are going on elsewhere. So they're always being marginalized, and they're always regarded somehow as being laggards or as striving to catch up to developments that are going on elsewhere. And this has been characteristic of the history of German art. Not so much in the sciences, where the Germans have excelled in philosophy and the physical sciences and in architecture, as well as literature. But in the realm of painting and the fine arts, it's been a somewhat different story. Going as far back here as Grunewald's Eisenheim altarpiece of 1512 here, which is what we have up on the screen, we can already see here, and Gombrich remarks on this in The Story of Art, that this dates, as I say, from about 1512. The Italian Renaissance has exploded, and they've discovered the new laws of depth perspectival space. But here, going on in Germany, we have a kind of conservatism regarding, there's a very strong medieval aura still about Grunewald's painting here. Christ, for one thing, is depicted as a giant being, so he's in a different space in relation to the figures surrounding him, the two Marys and John, and so forth. They're all tiny, shrunken figures, whereas Christ is a gigantic human. So there's still a very heavy medieval aesthetic, a pre-perspectival medieval aesthetic that's going on here, even while art simultaneously in Italy is moving on into a whole new world. So there's still a sense in which the Germans are very conservative and they're lagging behind developments elsewhere. Albrecht Dürer, of course, is the one who imports the Renaissance into Germany, but he isn't as celebrated a figure, I think, quite as figures like Leonardo and Michelangelo. Now, if we fast forward ahead here to the 19th century, and one of the things about 19th century German art is that it almost, if you went by the art history books, it almost appears that it doesn't even exist, with few exceptions, because it gets scant references and very little treatment. But there is some great art here in the 19th century, to be sure. It generally begins, it's a development that picks up with Caspar David Friedrich. This is his 1811 winter landscape, and Friedrich's art is very spooky. It became the sort of inspiration for the later set designs of the Universal horror films of the 1930s, and so he had a very, that becomes evident, for example, in this painting here of 1819, Graveyard Under Snow. The Germans have a kind of what Oswald Spengler characterized as a metaphysical turning toward death. They have a fascination with the otherworldly, with the abyssal side of life, and with death. And some of the other cultures, the French are always at odds with them, and the British regard that as a kind of morbid preoccupation that characterizes and stamps and almost disfigures German culture as a whole. But I regard it as precisely what is most fascinating about German culture. Even in a painting like this one, this is Adolphe Menzel, the French Window of 1845, which is the rival, I think, in many respects of French Impressionism. There is a sense here of the infinite, there's a kind of sense of the eternity that's moving and breathing through the moment in this painting here. It's a simple painting of a late afternoon setting, but you get the sense that there's another world peeking through here. No Frenchman would paint a painting with that sense of the otherworldly beginning to peek through a mere interior. It's all surface levels in French Impressionism. And then this is Arnold Björklund's Battle of the Centaurs from 1873, which is just 1 year after Nietzsche publishes his book on the birth of tragedy, which has a kind of similar neoclassical feel to it. The Germans are still painting neoclassical art here in the 1870s by the time that modernism has already arrived in Paris. and they have moved on to getting rid of Greek myths and getting rid of biblical references and historical meta-narratives, but the Germans are still persisting in painting classical and neoclassical themes all the way down into the 20th century. This is Franz von Stuck's 1903 painting Wounded Amazon. So going right on into the 20th century, they're still fascinated with Greek mythology and the archetypal transpersonal dimension. And even when they become modernistic, this is Max Beckmann's Synagogue of 1919. And this has a wonderful expressionistic feel to it, reminds one of the sets of the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. Very wonderful spatial distortions going on in this. Very modernist, but of course, when the Nazis came along, Beckmann was regarded as one of the degenerate artists. And so we get that with the whole Nazi outbreak and their branding of modernist art as an art of degeneracy. It becomes modernism in Germany becomes anathematized essentially from that point on down to the end of World War II. Here's Paul Klee, one of the great modernist artists. This is The Goldfish of 1925. It's a wonderful image with alchemical themes about sunken treasure and the buried gold and the spirit that is sunken in matter, that is ubiquitous throughout and has to be fished out. The alchemist was always trying to trying to liberate the spirit from its prison in matter, and metaphors about its being transforming base metals such as lead into gold was simply a metaphor for the process of cracking open the material world to reveal the numinous glow of the spirit trapped within it. And all through German art, you get this sense that they're all phenomenologists. They all have a sense about them that the world is not what it appears to be, that it's a series of surfaces that is concealing a deeper, more mysterious metaphysical dimension. And this is Otto Dix, 1932, the war. He paints the horrors of World War I, and here it's painted in grand German expressionistic style, almost as though it were a religious triptych. And you see the horrors of the trench warfare and so forth. So this is the German art up until down to World War II. But by the time we get to World War II and it finishes and it's over and the dust begins to settle, we begin to get a new phenomenon where German art with the contemporary landscape is no longer peripheral, but now is at the forefront. It becomes the avant-garde for the first time in the history of German art. Now it is the art, along with the New York Art Group, that is setting all the standards for the new art of contemporary art. This is Joseph Boyce's Sled of 1969, and Boyce is at the forefront, as we will see in the upcoming lectures on Boyce. He's at the forefront of this development of contemporary art, which came out of Dusseldorf. Now, Boyce taught at the Kunstakademie in the Academy of Art in Dusseldorf from 1961 to about 1972 or thereabouts. And Dusseldorf becomes now the center that rivals New York City as the second center, the second great center of contemporary art. And it produced a whole horde of great artists, and they're still coming out of Dusseldorf. Here is Gerhard Richter, who also came out of Dusseldorf. This is Anselm Kiefer, who also spent some time at Dusseldorf at the Art Academy there. This is his Palm Sunday of 2006. And also Odd Nedrum, the Norwegian painter. This is his String 2 from around 2005 to 2010, somewhere in there. Odd Nedrum, as we'll see, also spent some time at Dusseldorf. He was briefly a pupil of Joseph Boyce, but his adulation of the style of the old masters was something that for him alienated him from the contemporary art movement, and he went back to Oslo. But both, the interesting thing about Odd Nedrum and Joseph Boyce is that both were interested in the works of Rudolf Steiner. This is Peter Angermann, who is also one of Boyce's pupils. This is Spirale of 1988, and it's a kind of neo-expressionist updating of contemporary German art. And then more recent artists who have come out of Dusseldorf, and there are quite a few of them. This is Thomas de Man. This is Haltestelle from 2009, or Hallestelle from 2009. And the interesting thing about Thomas de Man, what he does is he constructs these faux environments. This is not a photograph of an office. To echo Magritte's painting, this is not a pipe. This has been modified, and it's a simulated environment that almost looks like an installation, except that what de Man does is he simply builds these environments and then photographs them, and it's the photograph that he's after, because then he destroys the installation after he produces the photographs. Here's another one of Thomas de Man's works, Pacific Sun from 2012. And his works they never have human figures in them. That's the interesting thing about his simulated reconstructions of offices and various environments, is they look as though people have just recently been there, but aren't there anymore. And there are lots of weird, creepy things about these simulacra. They look realistic at first glance, but when you look more closely at them, you see that the papers don't have any writing on them, for instance, or there's nothing on the documentation. There's no image on the computer, on the cash register screen there in this sort of cafeteria thing, and so forth. And then there are some great photographers who have also come out of Dusseldorf. Andreas Gursky is one of the great contemporary photographers. This is his Paris Montparnasse of 1993. And here's another one by Andreas Gursky. This is the Rhine 2 from 1999. Gursky has a wonderful, he photographs as though he were a painter, and he photographs things in chiseled, ordered layers of strata. He has a very stratified approach to photography, a very wonderful photographer. And another great photographer who came out of Dusseldorf recently, Elger Esser. This is from 2008, Port Angeles. His paintings are these very washed, or rather his photographs are these very washed out, bright, luminous images with a single horizon line in the background. And the exposure is very bright. And though Gottfried Helmwein, this is Gottfried Helmwein from 1974, Beautiful Victim, did not come out of Dusseldorf, he nonetheless is part of this great explosion of German contemporary art now that comes out of all this and puts Germany on the map for the first time as the avant-garde, the new leaders in the development of contemporary art. And so that's where we're at. That brings us to right to the threshold where we need to be to look at the works in more detail now of Joseph Boyce, and we'll go through Ad Nedrum, and we will also look at Anselm Kiefer and Gerhard Richter in some detail in these coming lectures.